in the 20s, one of the kings of Afghanistan tried to reform the country, you know, from on top, modernize it in our sense of the word, you know, an efficient bureaucracy, that kind of thing. He got overthrown by the feudal elements. I'm using the term feudal. The technical term for that kind of regime is Oriental despotism. But, you know, it doesn't make much sense to modern Americans. What Oriental despotism is like, I'm the king, here's my corrupt government, you get along with my corrupt government, I give you a job, okay? If you don't like it, I'll have you trampled to death by an elephant. If you want to go into exile to the next country over, he'll trample you. The king there will trample you to death if you speak out against him, okay? That's that kind of regime, all right? The weakness of that kind of regime is that the military in that kind of regime is modernist. If you're a soldier, it doesn't matter what government you're with, you want the most up-to-date military technology. Doesn't matter what government, right? Because you're a professional soldier. So that makes the military in that kind of regime very scientific-oriented. They don't care. Did the Christians invent the machine gun? Did the Jews? Did the atheists? Who cares? Okay? So they become a progressive element in the society. And what happened in Afghanistan is really very simple. There was a communist party there, and it began to recruit officers, not just rank and filers, officers. Okay? And because their attitude was the Soviet Union, they could just look over the fence, so to speak, and they could see a modern society, which is what they wanted to be. So they were all very pro-communist, and they used one of the king's relatives to get rid of the king, and then Dawood was his name, and they set up a republic. And then, as Dawood began to move more to the right, the communists, the pro-Soviet communists, and the military overthrew him. Okay, so now you had a pro-Soviet communist regime, but the regime, it had two fundamental problems. One was that Afghanistan was one of the poorest countries in the world. There is natural gas there, but no one was pulling it out. Only 9% of the population could even read and write, which meant that the military and this minuscule urban element, you know, that could read and write, were trying to modernize a very backward society. So apparently, all the scholars are pretty much in agreement, was that the Communist Party split into two factions, one of which decided, just chop off some Muslim heads. You know, and you chop off enough heads, the rest of them will get the message, okay? And the other one, the other faction, that faction was called the Khalq faction, and the other one, the Parcham faction, their attitude was, hey, we live in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has its society. You got to do things a step at a time, all right? But both of them agreed, both factions agreed, of course, women got to get their rights, etc. Now, what happened was that at the same time that the United States was backing the Shah in Iran, the United States started to subsidize the Islamic fundamentalists in Afghanistan, all right? Even before the Soviets invaded. Well, the Soviets invaded because they suddenly saw, and now understand, the Soviets had nothing to do with the creation of the pro-communist regime in Afghanistan. All the scholars, in the Wall Street Journal, everybody agrees on that. It was a purely domestic situation. as I say, the army just had to look over the border, and as far as they were concerned, the Soviet Union represented modernism to them. Okay, all right. I mean, there's no real argument about that. But when they saw that the Islamic fundamentalists were beginning to move against the Khalq government, they invaded to replace the Khalq government with the Parcham faction, okay? And they, the communists, actually claimed that the head of the Khalq faction was a CIA agent, which was just not true. I mean, that was just their excuse for executing him, that kind of thing, all right? In other words, what I'm basically trying to say is that you have to look at the pro-Soviet regime there as clearly a better government than anything that happened afterwards, but don't have any illusions that it was some kind of, wonderful state or anything like that. I mean, they were literally executing each other, the Stalinists, etc. But on one key question, women's rights, both factions, believed in women's rights. Simple as that, okay? So how do you get Jimmy Carter, who believes in women's rights, and Brzezinski, who believes in women's rights, and Madeleine Albright, who believes in women's rights, how did they wind up supporting the Islamic fundamentalists? They developed the notion in their heads that the invasion of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was connected with the downfall of the Shah, and that the Soviets were moving into the Persian Gulf. Now, there's not a bit of truth in that. Again, all the scholars, right-wing, left-wing, doesn't matter, they all agree on that. I would say that the analogy, the best analogy to that aspect of the Afghan thing is in 2003, George Bush decided to go into Iraq to get rid of those weapons of mass destruction. Now, those weapons of mass destruction only existed in their heads. And similarly, the idea that the Soviets were on the march down into the Persian Gulf only existed in Jimmy Carter and Brzezinski and Madeleine Albright's heads. Okay? I'll give you another analogy to that, since I'm a scholar on the Holocaust, etc. From 1929 to 1933, all right, let's put it this way. In 1928, when Hitler ran for office, he got 2.5% of the vote. All of a sudden, the Depression happens, and the next thing you know, the German capitalist class starts backing Hitler, okay? Now, they were not looking to kill any Jews. Hitler might have been thinking that. We know he was thinking that. But they weren't. All they were looking for was a commie basher.